evening. TJ here once again at the Imaginary Gallery. Tonight's discussion or topic is actually a true story, of which illustrates an example of narcissistic abuse, which could also include any type of toxic person abuse. I'll give you a little background before I tell you what my own eyes witnessed. I happen to have a friend that I work with who happens to have a little Pomeranian dog who needed a place to stay one particular weekend that she was going out of town to visit some of her friends. So, of course, I've got two little puppies, or two little doggies, so I figured we'll watch her. So she brought the doggie over and dropped it off on, let's say, I think it was a Friday. And great. Well, the background here is this lady is married to what I believe to be a toxic person. A person with traits of cluster B, which we know overlap many different labels, so we'll skip those. The point is, it's toxic. Well, before this event occurred, I would hear stories from her about him in the workplace where she would say that in the beginning when they first met, that for no reason the husband would just like start accusing her of having an affair with this person or having an affair with that one, or that she's cheating. And she said that in the beginning it really hurt her because she's a person with feelings and emotions, a full spectrum of emotions, who is empathetic and sympathetic and so on. And I'm hearing this story, and she tells me things like that he accused her of something she didn't do, and said that at the beginning she would like plead and beg because she really believed he was having this rage, which I think is narcissistic rage. But I also told her I think he's probably projecting, because if you didn't do anything strange or disappear for several hours and he's saying these things, he's probably up to something. But she can be naive sometimes too, so she may not even realize this, so we don't know. But anyway, she said that, and then she also told me about how he would argue with her and again act jealous, which is a common trait of these disordered people. They're jealous of everybody, anything, and everything. And evidently, at one point, he was so jealous of some fictitious created event, he smashed her phone. That's actually not the first phone smashing example I've heard, but these types love to smash their partner's phones for some reason. But that was one story. Then another one would be that he'd be really mean and evil and yell and scream stuff with the neighbors listening, and then later he'd be real nice. And she could eventually recognize the niceness is fake. With these people, it always is. Because a person that nice wouldn't be that mean. It's just two opposite ends of a spectrum. Well, I knew all this, and I had my, I assumed that he must be a disordered person of some kind. And because I've been exposed to that very type of situation, the stories I'd hear would be like some things I could relate to, because it's like, well, I know a person who did the same thing. Oh my. And it's fascinating how, again, these people are so creative. They all do the same things, but they think that they're the best. Well, back to the dog. She dropped the dog off, and she went out for the weekend with some of her lady friends. No husbands involved. So she left. I watched the dog, and eventually it became Sunday. So I was lounging around the house, and she texted, "I'm on my way to pick up the dog." So I was ready and waiting, and evidently I didn't realize this, but the husband, the one that I'd heard all about all this time, happened to be driving her there. And she came in the house before she took the dog. We just talked like, how was the trip? What'd you do? What'd you see? What'd you do? So on. And and she would tell, and then we'd gather the dog stuff, put it all together, and after a few minutes of just discussion, regular, just discussion that anybody would have, and finally she said, "Well, she better go." Well, she took the dog, and then she walked to the front door and noticed the car, her husband's car, was gone. So she's like, and then she realized her phone was in the car with him. So here she was picking up her dog, and the husband that drove is gone. So she asked to borrow my phone, which I gave her. She dialed his number. It's like, "Where are you at?" And he was evidently saying something fishy or strange or crazy. So she gave the phone back, and like a few minutes later, the car drove around the block, and I saw his face, and the window was down, and he had the narcissistic rage look in his face, and he was saying crazy things. Now, I was lounging around the house in a robe, and it was about 5 minutes, maybe seven, she was in there. But he was like looking at me saying, "What's he wearing a robe for? Why is he in a robe? You never came out. You've been in there. What did you do in there?" And then all of a sudden, he said something else like, "And who's that guy I just saw? He just walked behind the back of your house. Who?" And the back of my house is like a fenced-in, closed area that won't go any further than the back of my house. But he pointed out some man. "Who's that guy? Who is he?" And he just, the voice he was using was full of narcissistic rage, and it was like I'm doing now. It's like, "Who's that guy? Who is he? What's he in a robe for? What's he wearing?" And I heard it all, and I saw it all, and because I've experienced that kind of stuff, I mean, I knew it was crazy and weird, but at the same time, it felt actually familiar. Like, I know what that's like to deal with. And it was just bizarre because, first of all, I've never even touched this lady in any type of inappropriate way. And she was only in there for like 5, 7 minutes. And yet, here's this man leaving in a fury, then coming back and making some kind of accusations about me or some guy. And from my experience, again, it was like real life projection, and told me this guy's up to something. I mean, that is not regular behavior, especially with the circumstances involved. Like 5 to 7 minutes. Come on now, what could you do in that amount of time? Reminds me of the scene in White Chicks when the girl's grilling her husband about the 2 minutes or whatever difference it took him to get home, and so on. But it's like, that's like a movie and funny, but this was real life, so it was crazy. And it does relate a little bit to another situation that was mine that I thought would be interesting to add, because I said that I'd been through stuff like that. Well, here's a similar story. It involved when I was involved in a very long-term 11-year queer relationship with a monster. And we'd eventually moved into a house together, and one particular evening, I believe I looked in his books because he cut hair, because he'd be busy in the shower or whatever. I'd look at the books and say, "Okay, he's off at his last appointment 6. He should be home about 7." So then I would do my regular thing, and then that night, 6 o'clock would come, 7 o'clock would come, 8 o'clock would come, 9 o'clock would come, 10 o'clock, and I'd be calling, like calling the phone number, and like no answer. It's just voicemail. So I'm like, where is this? I would even call the coworkers, like, "Hey, is so and so still working?" "Oh no, he left hours ago." And so I'm sitting there at this point, because I didn't even have a clue I was dealing with any kind of cluster B anything. I just thought, well, this is not normal. And so I was like thinking, what do I do? I mean, it's been several hours, and I was just worried because, again, it was weird because normally there'd be a phone call or some kind of contact, which there wasn't, so I didn't know what to really think. So I just like paced back and forth, and finally picked up the phone. And I have a lady friend that, not the same one, a different one, but I call her. It's like, "Hey, I just want to talk to you. So and so isn't home, and I'm concerned because he doesn't answer the phone, isn't at work, It's hours later since he left, and so I was just like worried, and I was thinking things like, do I need to drive up and down the highway and look maybe for a smashed up car? I mean, I was asking her for advice, like, what do you suggest I do? And this was like, I mean, I was genuinely concerned because it just wasn't like this person to do this. So, eventually, time kept passing, but then finally I was standing there with the phone to my ear like this, and then I looked up, and there's his car. It starts to drive into the driveway, and I thought, oh, he's here. Okay, everything's fine. All right. Thank you. Well, after this, he comes in the house after seeing me standing there like this, and he walks in and says, "Who's on the phone? Who are you talking to? Who is that? Who are you talking to? Who are you talking to?" And I'm thinking, what? Where have you been? That's the question here. But that made me think something strange or fishy must have been going on, which of course I never found out what it was. But that's just a clue, because the person did turn out to be a giant cluster B. So that was one of the tactics used. So that's a clue for you guys and girls out there that are dealing with those kinds of things, where you're being told, or you're actually having things turned around onto you when you actually have the valid question. Because, I mean, where were you? That's the question, not who am I talking to. So I'm like, well, I'm talking to a friend of mine worried about you, thinking you're dead. And what are you doing? Anyway, that's a great story. You have a great night. Feel free to share your stories as well in the comments below. Good evening.